Good morning. I will be addressing primarily one of the questions that was posed to us, which is what is my interpretation of the term culturally appropriate in the context of food nutrition assistance programs, and then I will elaborate as needed. The definition of culturally appropriate food will obviously vary by individuals. My interpretation, not only as a nutritionist, but someone who also teaches health disparities in culture and foods, that foods that are culturally appropriate will correspond to individual and community demand and preferences. These foods will also be consumed regularly with minimal or no food waste, and they're less likely to be given away, thrown out, or traded. A lot of times when clients get their WIC foods, even if they don't eat it, they will trade it with other people because it's in my packet. So if it's culturally appropriate, these foods are less likely to be thrown out or traded also. Culturally appropriate foods are also less likely to aggravate any existing health issues such as lactose intolerance, constipation, or diarrhea. And importantly, there also will be a part of the cultural group's core food or secondary core food groups. And there was a handout at the registration desk where I attempted to look at how the WIC foods would play into the core foods, secondary core foods, as well as peripheral foods. I think sometimes the word culturally appropriate foods gets mixed in also with foods that are traditional, what are people's traditional foods. So I also want to address what traditional foods would mean within different cultures. And a traditional food would be something that has been consumed by a particular group for several generations. It's not necessarily what's traditional in my family per se, but within the group, and this group of people, this ethnic group, has been eating these type of foods sometimes for decades or even longer than that. They also have historic significance nationally, regionally, or locally, and also have very strong cultural ties. So I'll talk briefly about core foods, secondary core foods, and peripheral foods. All cultural groups have staple foods or core foods, and these are consumed frequently and form the foundation of the diet. These foods would be abundant, relatively inexpensive, easy to prepare, and are an important source of carbohydrates and therefore also an important source of calories. In most cultures, whole milk is considered a core food only for infants and young children, but not for adults. And milk is a secondary core food for the general American population of adults. Skim milk and 1% milk is usually considered unacceptable for most adults. However, 2% milk tends to be more acceptable than 1% or skim milk, and more people would then be shifting from whole milk to 2% milk. If any of you have the handout, you can also see here that when we're talking about the core foods, they're primarily going to be, with regards to the WIC program, the cereal grains. And the cereal grains that are offered by the WIC program right now, for example, the brown rice or the whole wheat tortillas, these are not typical core foods for most groups. The bulk of the world use rice as their primary core food, and it's white rice, not brown rice. And those that come from wheat cultures would be eating primarily processed or wheat noodles, not whole grain noodles. So what I've attempted to do is show how these foods that the WIC offers right now fit into core foods, but they tend to have a low likelihood of consumption. The secondary foods or secondary core foods are usually used to complement a meal. They also usually tend to be very abundant, and they are used in combination to make casseroles or staple dishes or traditional meals. And depending on the particular food, some may argue that some of these foods can also be core foods in some cultures. So examples of these secondary foods, especially as it pertains to the WIC program, would be fruits and vegetables, the beans, the peas, the lentils, the peanut butter, tofu, eggs, cheese, milk, and soy beverages. The peripheral foods are often very recent additions to a diet, and their use may be stimulated by specific economic conditions. And if you really want to begin to change a group's food pattern, then the peripheral foods do not have that much of an emotional tie as opposed to the core group. So these would be things that are the snack foods, the sweets, the chips. For the WIC program, these would primarily be, for some groups, juices and yogurt would be considered a peripheral food because for a lot of time it's a recent introduction to the diet. And I don't think WIC does Greek, I don't know if Greek yogurt is listed or just regular yogurt. But anyway, there's that trend now for the different types of yogurt, but not as much for the flavored. Okay, so then also looking then at foodways culture and acculturation. And the term foodways or food habits refers to the ways in which the food is obtained, stored, prepared, and eaten. It also includes how, when, where, how much, and with whom the food is eaten. And the WIC program obviously will be one of those places where the food is obtained. And WIC and other food nutrition assistance program really function in society as agents of food socialization. Other agents would be the family, the school, religious institution that have dietary restrictions or prescription. And so the WIC program, by default, because of the type of foods that they're provided and because they also provide nutrition education, is becoming an agent of food socialization. With the increase of immigrant population, whether through natural increase or through immigration itself, what we know is that the social network, the familiar institution, foods and custom, when they come to a new country, become unfamiliar and sometimes can be confusing and require significant adaptation. And so many immigrants are significantly challenged to adapt some of the foods offered by the WIC program because they're not part of their cultural foods. This issue of cultural appropriateness of WIC foods is especially relevant when we look at the Asian American population. So for example, dairy products, peanut butter, and most dried beans are not part of the traditional diet. And a lot of people are also unaware that Asian Americans have a high rate of lactose intolerance. And so we do have a high amount of dairy products that are in the WIC foods. One of the things also when we talk about some of the protein sources, that peanut butter is the only nut butter that is provided. And some of it might be a cost containment issue, but I know, for example, I have a very bad peanut allergy, but I can do almond butter. Some of those alternatives are not available to the WIC population. I think that health professionals should not also make assumptions as to where clients are on the acculturation process. We provide a broad framework to help nutrition professionals understand a culture, but we know that there's a lot of variation within cultures, and it is always important when necessary to actually ask the particular consumer whether or not these particular foods would also be acceptable for them. Because many people, for example, who may dress and speak like the mainstream, on the other hand, may still follow a lot of their traditional foods at home. So we should not necessarily assume by dress, by accent, or anything else that they will automatically fit into our preconceived notion of their particular foods. I think that cultural competence is an area that has not been addressed. We talk about nutrition education, but nutrition education without cultural competence does not become effective. So cultural competence of the health professionals conducting nutrition education is key to ensuring that the culturally appropriate WIC foods are purchased and, more importantly, consumed. Some states have noticed a drop in their WIC population over the last few years. Some of this, I believe, may be due to a lack of culturally appropriate foods, but also a lack of the knowledge and the skills to prepare certain foods. There's also a trend in some states to not have registered dietitians provide nutrition counseling. And I think still that registered dietitian is still uniquely qualified as opposed to other professionals to know about cultural competence as well as communicating the appropriate message in a timely manner. Thank you.